Managers of Reddit. What's the fastest you've had a new hire quit? Story 1. I used to manage a grocery store. We had to come in at 6 a.m. to start throwing the loads and getting the store ready for the day. Had a new hire come in 5 minutes late on our first day at 605 just to give me her locker key and tell me she has never woken up this early in her life and that she can't do the job. Edit terminology. Throwing the loads, working pallets of product from the truck out into the store. Company worded it that way. Story 2. Hired a delivery driver. Construction materials. First day, he had a 26-foot box truck and 3 stops in the Frederick, Maryland market, about 2 hours from our warehouse. He leaves at 7 o'clock a.m. and is back at 11:30 a.m. I see him and say, wow, that was really fast. He says he's going to get some cigarettes and we'll be right back in. Gets in his car and leaves. We open the truck and everything is still there, exactly as loaded. He doesn't answer his phone and never comes back. We never found out what happened for the next 6 months. Anytime anyone in the warehouse was having a bad day, they'd say I'm going to get cigarettes. Story 3. I once needed a new graphic designer in my unit. So I, as was procedure, told HR what I needed, and they came back in a couple of weeks with someone they had hired. He met us all, sat down, and was very confused. He was an accountant, not a graphic designer. They had hired him as an accountant and asked him lots of accounting questions. Nothing at all do with the position. HR was called. He left with them. I never saw him again. I hope they kept him on as an accountant. Story 4. I worked at a prison. We had a woman come and get hired for her first day, which is where we start the fingerprint scan to upload data to the feds and do your physical and TB test. She had gone down and not come back after 3 to 4 hours. We called down to see what was up. Turns out she was wanted 2 states over for identity theft and was now being housed at intake. Story 5. The fastest was the one who was a no-show their first day. It's all good. About 8 months later, they contacted us to say they were ready to come to work. Edit for those interested, this was a female. There was very clear communication on the start date, and no return calls. I legitimately did wonder if something happened, but social networking proved she was alive and well and not in jail or a coma. Story 6. I used to work at a community mental health center. Once we had a new front office person come in for her first day, leave for lunch, and never come back. Edit, well, this blew up. Never quite sure when I see 40 notifications if it's good or bad. Story 7. My uncle retired, and after some time had went by, he decided to get a part-time job at a bait store for some extra spending money. The afternoon boss told him to be there at 8 a.m., but when he showed up at 7:45 a.m. and knocked on the door to be let in, the morning boss told him that he was 15 minutes late. The guy started to get in his case about how he was expected to be there a half hour before his shift to straighten up and restock shelves. My uncle told him he could take his job and shove it up his. He was back on the road by 748. Story 8. I was the quitter. Sorry, I went to interview my dream job, came home crying because I thought I had bombed the interview, called up the grocery store that had offered me a job as soon as you get into town. The next morning, I go in and do the training exercises and start learning to scan groceries. The HR person who was in charge of my paperwork and training went home without telling me. So after a while of what do I do next? Do I have a boss? I've been here 6 hours. Am I supposed to take a lunch? I got a phone call from the museum saying I got the dream job. I rushed out of there so fast, I had to hang the grocery store apron on the cart return because I accidentally took it with me. Story 9. The first day. I worked at a phone store in a very Hispanic neighborhood. He claimed to be fluent in Spanish in the interview. I probably should have verified that. He learned pretty quickly that he'd really need the Spanish, so he got super stressed and stormed off. I later found out he took a 900 camo Galaxy S5 with him when he left. Story 10. I worked at a place where I didn't get to hire the interns, but had to manage them. My VIP just hired pretty women. There were great interns and terrible ones, but Beth took the cake. She came in 30 minutes late. I started to take her through how our business worked, what our industry was like, and what she'd be working on. She was on her phone and got pissed when I told her to put away. She refused to take notes while I took her through all this. I then sat her down at 10:30 and asked her to clean a list of potential clients in Excel. She laughed and said she was getting a coffee, which I assumed was from our office. 45 minutes later, she shows up again with a Starbucks, and 20 minutes after that, she says she's going on lunch. I told her she used her lunch up to get that coffee. She needed to get some work done. She laughed again and left, didn't come back the rest of the day. I sent a note to her professor about this. The next morning, I got a call from her professor apologizing for her behavior and letting me know she would be failing her internship. My VIP was pissed because Beth seemed like just the kind of person we need around here. Story 11. I'm not a manager, but one time I went on vacation for a week. I came back and a few days later heard people talking about Frank or something. Had no clue who that was, so I asked, apparently had been hired, started working, stopped coming in, and apparently quit, was fired all in the week I was on vacation. Story 12. I used to work in a really small grocery store that usually only had one manager and one cashier in the store at all times. I had put up my 2 weeks' notice, and prior to leaving, trained up the new manager to take my place. The next day after I left, from what I was told, the manager quit 2 hours into their first solo shift, leaving the poor cashier behind, who had been there even less time than the new manager. Story 13, we hired a guy in a restaurant. He quit in 30 minutes. He was lazy and slow and realized that we all hustle harder than he was willing. We had a good laugh, called the second on the list, who showed up 45 minutes later and worked at double. That guy stayed there for a year and loved his job. Story 14, employee here. Had a guy get hired, was sent to get his drug test, and never came back. We tell them about the drug test when they fill out an application, and also when they interview. Edit just want to say, I don't know what the dude's deal was that day. Maybe he didn't think we were serious. Maybe something unrelated came up. I don't personally care what people do in their downtime, although sometimes ISTG some of these guys are high as at work. How do you hit and break a marked water line with a trowel? But that's another story for another day anyways. He technically worked there for only 0 minutes. Didn't even get to be issued his PP. I was told that he was called and asked why he wasn't back from going to get the drug test. And he replied, because I didn't go do the drug test. And when asked if he was going to, the answer was apparently a firm, concise nope. So that was that. Story 15, I was hired to work in a stockroom once. I didn't need a job at the time, but fancied a bit of extra money. Second shift, I got threatened with the sack cost. I went to the toilet 3 times in an 8-hour shift. Apparently, I should have told them I had a bladder problem on my application. Boss was a generally enormous turd in a few other ways too, but when I didn't need the job and was getting brought into her room to watch CCTV footage of me heading to the bathroom every few hours, I was like, yeah, nah. Story 16, we hired a girl for a live-on job. I worked on a university campus. She was hired, drove down like 3 to 4 hours, began her first day, apparently got some other offers that were closer to home, realized she made a huge mistake, packed her staff, and was gone that evening. Edit mint stuff. I understand the wizard comments now. Story 17, I was a supervisor at a grocery store a few years back. A guy I knew from high school got a job at my store and McDonald's at the same time. He told me that at the end of the month he would quit the job he liked less. The next day he quit from my store. I asked him why he wasn't waiting a month like he planned. Turns out, on his first day at McDonald's, all the other people on his shift, including the manager, went out back to smoke and left him running the whole store alone for a couple of hours during the lunch rush. The owner found out and fired everyone except him and promoted him to manager on his first day. He decided he didn't want to bag groceries after that. I didn't blame him. Story 18, 15 minutes. I hired someone to work in a manufacturing plant. We did a tour of how hot the floor would be during the interview. No problem. First day at work, he walked out after 15 minutes of work because it was too hot. Story 19, working at Jimmy John's, we hire an older woman to be a delivery driver. We tell her to put an apron on because when you aren't driving, you doing shop stuff. She said she wasn't going to make sandwiches and left. Edit job responsibilities are listed in the new hire packet we give everyone. It's their responsibility to read it through. It's a very short packet. We also pay minimum wage to drivers during in-shop times. Story 20, once I worked a temp job at a salmon canning factory for a week or two. We got a couple of new temps one day, a girl in her early 20s and a creepy Somalian guy who could have been 25 or 40. Somalian guy spends all day trying to hit on this girl, asking her if she will be his girlfriend within a couple of hours. He then begged her to go on a date with him to McDonald's on our lunch break. I guess he followed her to her car at lunch and started harassing her. She drove off and never came back. There's some real shitbags out there, and I feel terrible that women have to put up with people like that. Story 21, not technically me, but a manager in our company was struggling to hire someone at one location. I bumped into an old friend I used to be a server with, and she said she was unemployed and looking, linked them up. First day she came in and said, yeah, this isn't for me. I'm more of a manager personality, and quit that same day. You don't have a job, and I gift wrapped one for you at one of our best locations. We've had store managers ask for a demotion because they made more money as a clerk than they did as a manager. How about a story about the opposite? An employee refusing to be fired. I wasn't there when this happened, but I shared an office with this legend for a couple of years. It was a governmental agency, and they had hired a new supervisor. This particular employee and the new supervisor just did not get along. It was like oil and water, cats and dogs. Constant friction between them. For no reason and for every reason. He got wind that she was planning to fire him in a day or two. So he stopped going to work, figured that if she couldn't find him, she couldn't fire him. He refused to answer his phone. He refused to return messages. This was before email was widespread, but I'm sure he would have ignored that too. And then a miracle happened. The supervisor got fired a couple of weeks after he stopped coming into work. The new acting supervisor, who was the person who hired me, actually called this guy and told him it was safe to come back to work, so he did. By the way, this acting supervisor was a great guy. After I'd been there less than a year, and consequently didn't have much leave built up. I had a very serious health issue. It kept me out of work for an entire month. After my vacation and sick leave ran out, he just started marking me as being present with the understanding that I would work every extra shift possible. When I got back to pay back the time, it was one of the nicest things anyone has ever done for me. I left that job years and years ago, but saw on Facebook a couple of years ago that the legend retired with a full pension. Story 22, not a manager, but the employee. I quit a job the day before my first scheduled shift when the company I was working my last shift had offered me significantly more money. Story 23, I have had a number of construction laborers quit on the first day, including several roofing laborers who started at 7 o'clock a.m., climbed down the ladder for 10 o'clock a.m. break, and never came back. Story 24, this summer, I got a job as a lifeguard at a certain pool, since the one I really wanted to work wasn't going to interview me till the end of June. First day, manager says they're planning on having me work about 20 hours a week, but for most of June, I have to scrounge all my hours off other people because I joined up too late to be put on that month's schedule. Fair enough, I interview for the other pool, which is within walking distance, and they offer me $10.75 an hour compared to first place offering me state minimum at that time $9.25 with an imminent increase to $10. They want 5 days of my week, however, so I agree to not have a day off in my week and plan to have 10-hour shifts at my old job on the 2 leftover days, so I can still fulfill the 20 hours. I tell old job boss, and he's pissed because apparently despite hiring 3 or so guards after me, my new arrangement means he'll be understaffed and that he was planning on giving me more hours. I felt like it was bullshit meant to keep me stuck there more, but I threw him a bone and texted him asking how many hours a week minimum he needed from me to fix his understaffing issue. He doesn't respond for a full 21 hours. When he finally does, it's to ask me to come in early with no actual answer. In the meantime, new job offered me 40 hours a week if I quit the old job, and I off immediately and enjoyed a summer working at a pool within walking distance of my house, and with much better behaved patrons, I don't regret it. Story 25, I work an investment bank in London. After interviewing an internal candidate, different division, floor, etc., a couple of times, called her to offer the role and let her know the salary we could start her off on. She excitedly accepted. I immediately contacted HR via email to put the official wheels in motion, and an hour later, she called me back to let me know that she had to retract her acceptance as another internal role she'd interviewed for months ago had suddenly called to offer her that role. No mention of salary, just that she preferred the sound of the other role. A couple of months later, I looked her up on the intranet, and she's still in her old role. So I'm not sure what happened, a salary negotiation tactic that I didn't bite. Maybe the other role fell through if it existed in the first place. Who knows, a little embarrassing telling HR to ignore my last email, though. Story 26, not a manager, but an employee. During my interview, I specifically asked not to be placed on the tills, and the manager said she'd make sure I wasn't. My first shift comes around, and am placed on the tills by the manager, as all the aisle work is taken. I stayed for 4 hours before leaving and not going back. Story 27, my dad quit a construction job in the late 70s on his first day. He was late high school or so, and his employer did property restoration after natural disasters. The supervisor told him and another kid to go into the basement and fortify the foundation or the structural beams without proper safety precautions. Dad told him no. Supervisor threatened to firing. Dad took the firing. Story 28, worked as an interim assistant manager for a bridal store. We had our amazing manager leave, and the assistant manager that took her place was god awful. Talking refused to work even mandatory weekends because there was always a problem with the babysitter for her granddaughter, and we would get written up if we were late. Try to give me a 25 an hour raise after 2 years of raises being frozen. I put in my 2 weeks after that. And, that was my response to being offered that. I later found out the district manager had told her to offer me 4, and at one point she refused to hang up the phone with her husband after a lunch, leaving me alone in the store for an hour after my shift and making me late to pick up my son from daycare. She then tried to yell at me for going over hours. All of this is just background to make people understand how shitty of a boss she was. My last week, we had a new hire and alterations come in and do some training. He was only there for 3 hours, and in that 3 hours, 2 of the other bridal consultants got into a fight. Not a tiff, a full-on screaming match. That shitty manager moved to the break room and then let them go at it for an hour. I had customers complain, brides leave the store, which not only cost the store money, but the consultants worked on commission. And finally, the new hire came out of alterations, asked me if this was normal, and then said he wasn't going to finish the paperwork because he was confident he could find a job where hour-long screaming matches didn't occur. He probably wasn't wrong. Story 29, we hired a machinist in training for our injection mold building division. Guy had run some CNCs before, but on a production basis, basically we'd need about 6 months to switch him over. When he started, we were the wall busy. All machines were dirty because you'd have 3 or 4 being run by one guy. His first task was to clean out one of the machines so he could get working with it. That seems below me. When I drive Uber, no one expects stupid chores from me. He made it less than 30 minutes. Honestly, in the 15 years I've been around this industry, I could tell you another 30 or so stories. Story 30, not a manager, but an employee. I worked on the chronically overworked, tiny housekeeping staff of a small city hospital. By tiny, I mean there were 10 of us for a 6-floor hospital with anywhere between 6 to 10 terminal cleans, top to bottom scrub. Takes about an hour if done correctly required on each floor daily. The managers like to have new hires do a working interview, where they would shadow an existing housekeeper. Unfortunately, management would usually have the potential new hire shadow on maternity, which was one of the more tame floors, usually only a few drips of blood, if anything. Then they'd be put to work on the ICUPCO, lots of blood, diapers and bedpans, mental health, strict safety requirements, regular on the walls, sometimes threats to physical health, or ER, lots of blood, high turnover with terminal cleans between each patient. We got to the point where the new hires regularly weren't showing up after lunch. Never to be heard from again, we managed to hire 10 people in a week after a job fair. 3 didn't show after lunch. 2 didn't show for their next day of work, 4 quit after a week, and 1 stayed just long enough to ride out the 2-week notice. Story 31, not a manager, but work in office. This was a few years ago when I was still interning while in college. We had a kid start fresh after graduating college, and he was gone 3 days later. He had never worked a job before except being a camp counselor at a hockey camp. He complained that all everyone ever does here is work, and that everyone was super old. Yes, we do work during our job, and the average age of his department was like 25. Story 32, oh God. I was the employee, and this happened recently. A local restaurant catering company was hiring for banquet servers and bartenders. I worked a day job, but needed the extra money and figured this was the perfect opportunity. I showed up to my shift at 3 o'clock, and the event manager was showing me around the building. It was absolutely disgusting. I mean, I already knew the bar was kind of on its way out, but I had no idea it was this bad. Slowly, I started to realize I'm the only person that is working this event. Not a huge deal. I have a ton of experience in banquets. It's not that hard. Then the woman lets me know it's a party of 130 people for a bat mitzvah. I'm sorry, what? You expect me to set up and work an entire event for 130 alone? Nothing was done. I had to set up tables, buffet tables, and bar in 3 hours. She also has to go to another event right then and leaves me alone to set up. I was literally almost in tears, and the host shows up with 30 kids about an hour early. I honestly almost walked out right then, but I felt awful for the little girl who was having the party. The event went about as awfully as you expect. The bar had no fruit or certain mixers, and I had to be my own bar back. I also had to take bar breaks to work the buffet stations and bus tables. I made about 20 in tips and was covered in food and grenadine. The breaking point was 5 little kids bitching at me for not having any grenadine left. I walked up to the event manager and said, sorry, I can't take it. I don't need this job, and I've been here for 8 hours without a single break. I'm leaving. To be fair, it was the end of the event and 11 o'clock, but she would have to break down alone or with staff from the bar. I actually left and did feel bad, but who thinks it's okay to have one person work a large event? I also still haven't gotten paid despite numerous requests. That place. Okay, I was not this guy's manager, but when I was a second-year surgery resident, a new intern came on July 1st. Per usual, his story was that he had already finished a pediatric residency, which meant that for him, residency time could be over, and he could go work as a pediatrician if he wanted. However, apparently his father was some sort of famous pediatric surgeon, and his plan was to now become a general surgeon, and ultimately to become a pediatric surgeon after further future fellowship training. He was put on call the very first night. The next day, I was told that around midnight, he went to the charge nurse, asked, "Are you in charge around here?" And when she said, yes, he silently handed her his pager and walked out, never to be seen again. I guessed he had enough of residency and certainly didn't want to be an intern again. Epic edit typo. Story 33. I was the manager at a diesel truck shop in college. My boss hired a mechanic who was supposed to have all his own tools. Dude shows up with a toolbox the size of a lunchbox on his start day. He made up some story about slowly bringing his tools over every day because his car was small. Whatever. I put him on an easy job replacing a thermostat on a medium-duty pickup truck. The book time on this job was like an hour. My day had gotten busy, and I realized that like 3 hours has passed, and homeboy hasn't even come in to even grab the new thermostat from me yet. So I go out to check on him and couldn't believe what I was seeing. The intake was off. The radiator was removed. All the coolant hoses were removed, and sitting in a cardboard box. There was coolant and oil all over the floor. It was totally insane. The mechanic had taken some drugs, apparently, and was on a different planet, rolling around under the truck. No reason to be doing this whatsoever to replace the thermostat on this truck. His phone was blasting the redneck kings of comedy, and he was covered in sunflower seed shells that he had spit all over himself. I turned off his phone and asked him what was going on, and he started crying, saying he couldn't figure out where the thermostat was. I told him to go home. It took one of my other mechanics like 2 hours to undo all the destruction he had done, and we had to put all new fluids in the truck because this dodo drained them all out into dirty pans all over the floor, and all of 30 minutes to replace the thermostat and get the truck back to the customer. My boss had hired this idiot, so I told him to call and fire him. The next day, he showed up to collect his paycheck for 3 hours of destruction and his lunchbox filled with tools. He made apologies, stole our yard dog that had lived at the shop for years, and we never saw him again. Story 34, I worked at Floor and Decor. On my first day of training, my trainer kept joking about how this place sucks and that how I wouldn't come back the next day. I reassured him that I wouldn't because at the time I had no plans to do so, and then an hour after I clocked out, I got offered another job for double the pay starting the next day. Story 35, we definitely had an admin staffer not show up for work on day 2 and let us know that the workplace just wasn't the right fit for her. Always suspected she had been harassed by a creepazoid upper management type with a reputation for such things. My very first full-time job, before I had a management role, came as a replacement for someone who had worked there for about 3 weeks and just vanished one day and didn't return about an hour ahead of being fired for being a complete screw-up, or so my boss said, only sending someone a few days later to collect the person's things they left behind on their desk and deliver a sorry. I just wasn't up to it. Thanks for the opportunity kind of letter. Story 36, I was the employee, picked up an overnight shift at a grocery store stocking the shelves. I already had a job and went to school and thought I could use the extra money. I went in for my first shift just after getting off my previous job. They put me in a room where I had to sit and watch a video for an hour that looked like it was filmed in the 90s. Then after that, I started facing products on the shelves. 5 minutes into that, I remember the video saying something about if you walk out on a shift, you're essentially quitting. I couldn't listen to music while I was doing this. I had to be clean-shaven all the time. What a waste of a glorious beard. Convinced myself that this job would be soul-sucking and not worth it. Walked out, 0 regrets. Story 37, I have people take the job, then not come into induction all the time. They are too polite to say no thanks, or I've changed my mind. Costs a fortune and resource to have them set onto the payroll systems, order uniform plan spaces on induction, and instructors. So it's so frustrating when people just don't show, normally for no reason. Story 38, we had an intern start who had been emailing us 247 for months asking for work experience, how it was their passion, etc., etc. They also interviewed really well at the informal coffee interview we had with him, where we explained what the internship would entail. They arrived early for day 1. Seemed really positive during the morning induction. We got them set up with a desk and their email login, etc. When got a lunch, we told them they had just over an hour. They were welcome to go out and get lunch and eat it outside or in our canteen. It was up to them. He said he would go out and get some lunch and see us back in a bit. He never came back. We got really worried. He wouldn't pick up his mobile. We went looking for him. We emailed him, and then we had to call his emergency contact just in case he had been hit by a bus or something. We eventually got a text message from him that just said sorry. I don't think he'll be coming back. Story 39, we hired a dude to be a janitor at our office. He left not even an hour into the day while still reading the employee manual, and we don't really know why. I think he was afraid that he was going to get drug tested a little. Story 40, not a manager, but I work for a decently popular e-commerce store. Despite our store's popularity, our headquarters location was pretty run down at the time. We had a new social media manager start, and on her 3rd or 4th day, she went to use the bathroom and accidentally walked in on our copywriter pooping bathroom door. Didn't always lock properly. She quickly went back to the main office, grabbed her bag, and we never heard from her again. Story 41, when I worked at Target as a GSDL, I had a new hire come in, worked 30 minutes, asked for a smoke break since it was slow, and never came back. I called her cell an hour later, and she answered was boring, that was it. We sent her a check for her time, which she came in and cashed at the guest services desk. She later did which was terrible for the record. Story 42, I hired a receptionist that worked out great on day 1. First thing in the morning on day 2, she asked me about the parking situation and where her spot was. I then received a call about an emergency at a satellite office. I told her that her only responsibility was to answer the phone until I returned. And if I was needed, I would be available by cell phone. As I was gathering my things in my office to leave, she entered and told me, I don't think this is going to work out. This is too much responsibility to fast. She then turned around and left. I laughed out loud because she obviously was joking. She never came back. I guess she wasn't joking. So I had her for about 25 hours. Story 43. This was me 4 years ago. A startup nonprofit gig got back to me about environmental work, and I figured why not? That's what I study. Thought it was office work, but turns out it's day-long canvassing, standing on a busy sidewalk with a clipboard asking people for donations. I bared through the first day of training, but on the second day, when we actually went out to the field, I realized it was not my cup of tea, absolutely draining. I quit that night of, not a job for introverts, lol. Story 44. At the bar I work at, we had a girl quit after one shift as a waitress. Apparently, she didn't want to work the night of a big football game. Even though we needed her, like what did you expect? Working at a bar, you don't really get many of those big nights off. Story 45. I had one woman who got hired on as a courtesy clerk. So pushing carts, bagging groceries, etc. I was the mid-shift manager, and she came up while I was doing Western Union and explained that she had been hired on to work customer service, which confused me since she was labeled as a courtesy clerk. So I sent her to my hiring manager to get everything straightened out. She never came back. Heard later she quit on the spot, not 5 minutes after clocking in for her first shift. Story 46. I got hired as a barback on New Year's Eve and was asked if I could work that evening. Knowing that the money is good on such a night, I grudgingly canceled my plans and went to work, only to find out that I wasn't going to be sharing any of the tips that night and that it was an unpaid training shift. Yeah, no thanks. I waited until it got good and busy and took a bunch of drink orders that never got punched in before walking across the street to resume my evening plans at the fun bar. Story 47. Let me tell you a bit about one of the worst jobs and managers I have ever had that had one of these signs on the front door. Her name was Carol, part owner-manager of the Japanese restaurant I worked at in college. She was 100% the reason why that place had a revolving door of cashiers and delivery drivers, and she knew it but didn't care. In her eyes, if you couldn't stand her, then you were weak. Anyway, the way this place worked, you started off at the less busy location with the other owner-manager, Cindy. Cindy was really nice, patient, and a cool person. You were trained for a few days there by her, and whoever was the cashier on shift on all the duties. You were lulled into this false state of security by the place and by Cindy, until you were transferred to the other location with Carol. The other location was much busier, so even though you were trained about stuff, it can get overwhelming as a new person, and Carol takes this opportunity to berate you. If you're slow, she gets in your ear and starts yelling at you to hurry up, and uses the customer to guilt you by saying things like, "Come on, why you keep this nice lady waiting? If you forget the specific order to do something or slightly messed up, she asks you if you're stupid and calls you useless as she pushes you out of the way to do it herself." If you think Gordon Ramsay was bad, Carol was way worse. I've seen her make new cashiers quit and run out the store crying. She was borderline psychotic too. One of her favorite tricks to play on new cashiers drivers was to have you come to the back in the kitchen and have you help wash the dishes. She would then stand next to you sharpening the sushi knife on a whetstone. She wouldn't say a word, just sharpen it, and then all of a sudden she would bring the back of the blade and slap you on the arm with it. She enjoyed seeing people freak out and would laugh maniacally after. I was glad I never gave her that satisfaction because I was warned by one of the cooks about it beforehand. Even when she wasn't there, because she would sit at home and watch the security cameras. If she saw you standing around when things weren't busy, she would call the store and yell at you. You weren't safe as a driver either because she loved calling you and asking where you were and telling you to hurry up with the delivery, even if you didn't have another one waiting for you when you got back. I remember one time when I was a cashier and there was another driver. He came back from a delivery super happy because he got a 20 tip from someone. The lady he was delivering to got locked out of her house where she came outside to get the food. He was able to pull his van up close, climb on top of it, and get onto this balcony that was open to let her back in her house. She was so thankful he went above and beyond that she wrote him a 20 tip. When Carol saw that, she refused to give it to him and accused him of adding zeros to a 2 tip. He showed her the footprints on the top of his van, but it wasn't good enough for her. So he had to call the customer to get her to confirm, and even when she did, Carol was still reluctant to give him the 20, but eventually caved. She just loved sucking the joy out of people's day. During my time, there only me and that cashier that trained me were the only ones that lasted behind the register. Everyone else would come and go. I watched so many people quit after spending just a couple of hours with Carol that it was ridiculous. This was years ago, and I'm sure the situation hasn't changed at all.